Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article says a case for down to earth governance. This article here speaks about multiple areas of governance. It starts with the introduction note of corruption in the system, role of money when it comes to the electoral politics, work performed by the elected representatives, inner party democracy, and ultimately ends with the responsibilities of the citizens as well as the local governance. First, let us try and understand the meaning of corruption as given under this article. Corruption is a universal phenomenon. No society is free from it. It has become the part of governance, unfortunately. From the grand corruption scandals, which includes the 2G, or it includes the Colgate or the Commonwealth. It may also include petty corruption charges where we have to pay bribes to the government officials for moving off the files as well. This shows that corruption is deeply ingrained in our administration. It is a malice to the development, weakening the image and credibility of the country. People of the country were frustrated, enraged, and they were waiting for an opportunity. In comes the Anna Hazare movement. It was fighting the corruption, the age old issue, and with all this in picture, what we have is the legislature passing the Lokpal. We were happy that the Lokpal was passed. We were happy that the Prime Minister, the ministers, and even the secretaries for the Government of India all came under the ambit of the Lokpal. But this, unfortunately, is not into reality. It is only on the paper. When it comes to the real execution, this is not happening. Why? That is because the prosecution cases is way too less. There are limited powers that are afforded to all these people. Then we have lack of support from other agencies as well. You have the CBI, you also have the CBC, you also have the ED, and these and multiple agencies may not be accommodating the Lokpal as well. Then we have the appointment of the personnel, which has to be done on a timely and a periodic basis. But then the government has also been tardy and lackadaisical in its approach as well. And as a result, all the fight that Anna Hazare movement did, the introduction of the Lokpal did, has become a futile exercise with the implementational flaws when it comes to the corruption. Now let's look at the second argument. It is speaking about money in the electoral politics. Generally speaking, elections is the festival of democracy. From the rich to the poor, they are part of this festival, exercising their political justice of voting. But is justice really served when it comes to the political scenario? No is the answer. Why? Because you have number of people who are contesting the elections. Who are these people who are contesting the elections? They are the ones who have money power. They are the ones who have muscle power, and they are the ones who are crorepati's as well. When you look at statistics, there are more than 50% of the people in the parliament who are crorepati's who are contesting the elections. So is political justice served to the poor man? No is the answer, because they are not being given tickets by the political parties, and that is the major concern. The second issue is with respect to the election funding as well. Now let's imagine what would happen during the elections. What would happen? You would have the political party which would have given ticket to a particular person. So this person will start canvassing for himself. This person will also have a coterie of people who will stand behind him as well. So there is huge canvassing that happens, and there is huge money that is also being spent as well. This is on the front face, but behind the scenes, what you would also have is alcohol being distributed. What you will also have is biryani is being distributed, and people are also bribed as well. This is illegal. This is illegitimate. This is what is done illegitimately. But this keeping aside, what we also have is some of the legal sanctions given by the laws as well. What are these legal sanctions? This includes all the political candidates who are contesting from a political party. They may have to spend money as well. So this money is already sanctioned. This money can be spent by the political candidate for his own canvassing as well, which means that there is legal spending and there is illegal spending as well. The legal spending is sanctioned by the law, and the illegal spending happens behind the doors as well. So for the legal spending, what you again require is huge amount of money, whether it is for the placards, whether it is for advertising, whether it is for petrol, whether it is for meeting supporting people as well. All this requires huge amount of money. So what we have to realize is that even if one party has about 1 million in its kitty, there is another party which is also wanting to win the elections. It is also raising money, let's say about 2 million. So what this means is that raising more money for legitimate electioneering, which is already sanctioned by the law, can corrupt the process of funding parties as well as elections. So what would happen? The party will have to win the elections by hook or crook, and then the party starts taking money from the corporate offices, from the supporters as well. In the near future, there would be policies which would be supporting them, which is in the form of crony capitalism or awarding of all these important contracts to their supporters. This is also indirectly raising the corruption, is the second argument put forward by the author. The third argument is speaking about responsibility of the elected representatives. Let's say, for example, I'm contesting the elections from a constituency. It can be a MLA ticket or it can be a MP ticket as well. There are two things here. One is the constituency, the other is the political party giving me the ticket. Let's say hypothetically, I've also won the elections from that particular state, or I've also won from a particular seat with respect to the parliament as well. After I have won this particular election, there are two dilemmas that a person goes through, that is the elected representatives goes through. What are these? One, should I be representing my constituency? Should I be meeting the needs of my constituency, or should I be representing the political party, or look at the larger interest of the state and the larger interest of the country? In case I'm not meeting the demands of my constituency people, I would be voted out immediately in the next elections. But if I'm not meeting the demands of the political party, the whip can be issued against me and I might be terminated from the party as well. And if I'm not looking at the larger interest of the state or the larger interest of the parliament, that is when I might be spoken that I'm compromising about the nation's growth or the state growth as well. This is the complete dilemma as well. So at this particular picture is what we have called as the influential corruption. So what is this influential corruption? Let's say, for example, if I'm just a legislator and I'm not in one of the cabinet member, I'm not even a minister. So what do? I make use of my influence and make sure that there is some deposits, some money, some funding from the government at the cost of some other constituency, that I pull this money into my constituency. So what am I doing here? There is influential corruption that is happening. Ideally, this amount of funding should not have come to my constituency, but because I have to win the elections in the next year, because I have to win the elections in the next term, so what do? I use my influence either by religion, either by caste, either by language, or any which means, and I make sure that there is funding in place of the some other constituency. This is where the influential corruption comes into picture. And at the same time, let's say, for example, I'm not into the influential corruption, but I want to look at the larger interest of the state as well, or with respect to the political party and its manifesto. So what should happen is there should be something called as the inner party democracy. Why? Within the inner party democracy, what we will have is we can question another person. Let's say there are a number of legislatures within a political party, so I would be able to question what is happening within the party. So this is within the political party, so the whip cannot be issued against me. Why? Because the whip will only be issued if I'm voicing my concern without the permission of the party. Within inner party democracy, I would be able to voice out my opinion. This means there can be all the altercations and there can be opposite opinions as well. So when there is no inner party democracy, there could be a possibility where the self-aggrandizing politicians may amass the power and also the wealth in the name of constituency development, is the fourth key argument. As we speak about this elected representatives, we have to look at other side as well. What do we have? We have the indirect system of democracy, where people elect the representatives and representatives put the voice of the people in the parliament or in the state legislative. But what about thinking in terms of direct elections? According to the author, we should not even think of direct elections. Why? One is because of the huge population, and also because people would not have any idea about some issues as well. Let's say, for example, it would also create chaos when it comes to certain issues, and people might well not know about its impact as well. One such example is with respect to Brexit. So what is happening here? Because there is direct involvement of the people, there could be a possibility they would not know what is its impact. Why? Because all this requires reasoning, the complex issues require logic, this requires analysis and not numbers as shown in the direct elections. So what are we supposed to know? That in case we are thinking of an alternative approach which is not indirect and it is direct, such cannot be thought of in India. Why? Because the complex issues should be decided by reason, logic, analysis and not only numbers, say the author of this article. So the best option is local governance. Because we cannot think of the direct elections, what can we think of is the local governance. What is this local governance? This is the third tier of the governance. This is where the principle of subsidiarity comes into picture. So all those important powers which can be given to the local governance, which means to the Panchayati Raj or to the municipal corporations, they will have to be given to them, so that all the people within that particular locality and that particular ward and constituency discuss what is good for them. So instead of what we have as the top down approach which is coming from the central government, what we require is the bottom up approach where people decide what is good for them when it comes to its application. So what is the option that we have? Instead of top down approach, instead of one size fits all approach which has been designed by the experts, what we require is the bottom up approach where people decide what is required with the help of the experts in that particular area. Experts are once again required, but what we have is negotiations, discussions, deliberations and all arguments put forward by the people in that locality, and what they decide, they build a consensus, they negotiate, and ultimately there will be some trade-off, and finally what we will have is one particular policy that which is adopted by that neighborhood which should be implemented, is what this article all about. So this article overall is speaking about corruption and how it can be reduced in India and how local governance can be enhanced as well. So this is what we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about Thoothukudi violence that happened in the year 2018 in the state of Tamil Nadu. Before we understand what this article is all about, let's look into the background. There is one of the companies called as the Sterlite Copper, which is an Indian copper producing unit of Vedanta Limited, which is a subsidiary of Vedanta Resources, the UK based mining as well as the metals conglomerate. What is this company all about? They engage themselves in the mining activity. This is mainly involved in mining copper in Thoothukudi in the state of Tamil Nadu. This company, which was mining copper back in the year 2018, was producing about 4 lakh tons of copper back in the year 2018. And they also came up with a notification that they are planning to expand the operations, increase the production to about 8 lakh tons. The minute this notification was released, what we have is protest by the people who are in the Thoothukudi. Why? That is because when there is increase of the production, this can lead to environmental impact. This can also lead to health impact as well, and ultimately it is the people who are the major sufferers because of this operation conducted by the Sterlite Copper. So what is the environmental impact? Copper production, including mining, smelting, refining, is a hazardous industry. Why? Because the byproducts include lead, arsenic and sulfur oxides. The minute these are released into the environment, this will adversely impact the water, the soil and the air quality. Any company for that matter which is into mining production will have to make sure that there are some environmental regulations that it has to cater with. It has to meet all these demands. It has to make sure that it is meeting the demands of these environmental regulations. But if it is meeting these regulations, the cost of it might be comparatively increased, and at the same time the profit of this particular production might also drop as well. In this specific case, environmental regulations were not maintained, sustained and were not operationalized when it comes to the Sterlite Copper, and as a result the Supreme Court of India back in the year 2011 ordered the National Environmental Engineering Research Institute to inspect this copper smelting plant and submit a report. So this institute looks into it and it also comes up with a recommendation as well. According to this report, it found high levels of lead, cadmium and fluoride in the groundwater of the area. In fact, Sterlite had also contaminated the groundwater, air and soil and also violating all standards of operation. So as per this particular report, what we actually see is that they have been violating all the standards of operation and they have been violating the environmental regulations as well. This obviously means there would be impact when it comes to the health sector. Why? Because this particular industry might be operating in one particular source, but since it is contaminating the regions in and around, it means people would also be impacted as well. Why? The pollutants now enter the groundwater and people drink the groundwater and they could have issues when it comes to their health. In 2013, it was also said that there was a toxic gas leak from this very area and from this very company, and this also affected the people living around it. Now let's imagine what had happened in Vishakhapatnam. This was a similar case that happened back in the year 2013. People also suffered from headache, coughing and choking back in 2013 when it comes to this Sterlite copper as well. Looking at all these arguments, we have to look whether the environmental violations have taken place when it comes to its operations. We have what is called as the environmental impact assessment. Was it maintained? Was it sustained? And was it complied by is the first major question. And the second major question is it is closed by the marine ecosystem. How did the Pollution Control Board within the state of Tamil Nadu give permission for expanding its sources is the second important point. This leads to the next question as to why the project was given permission. That is because the politicians in Tamil Nadu or the government of that day back then would have thought that this would lead to development of the region. This would lead to development of jobs in the region. This would lead to tax collection and this would also lead to copper extraction where they would be able to export this as well. These are the reasons why the government might have given permission to the Sterlite copper. But this leads to a couple of concerns as well. What are these concerns? When the permission is being given by that particular government, it also has to look at not only the development perspective but also the impact it will have on the environment, it will have on the health as well. In case this is not taken care of, it is the people who will be the major sufferers. And at the same time, the Pollution Control Board should have acted in a smart way and it should have made sure that all the rules are complied by. But the Pollution Control Board in the state of Tamil Nadu was not professional enough, or it was subservient to the political parties or the government of that day during 2018. So this means the health impact, the environmental impact, the unprofessionalism as well as subservient nature of the Pollution Control Board is what caused this Sterlite issue in the state of Tamil Nadu. Now comes the real issue. So as this particular issue started where they wanted to expand the operations, they wanted to increase the production, there was increase of protest in this very state. So as this happened, the plant was closed in 2018, and as the protests increased, there was a fight between the police officers as well as the general public, and this also led to killing of about 13 people by the police officers. The operations of this particular plant was immediately shut as well, and that is when this particular company approaches the Madras High Court. So the Madras High Court has now said that reopening of the Sterlite copper plant will not take place in Tamil Nadu, and the company now has gone to the Supreme Court of India. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about non-alignment, which happens to be one of the important principles of the foreign policy. It speaks about alliance, it speaks about geostrategy, and it also speaks about what needs to be done in the near future when it comes to India and its foreign relations. The first important factor is with respect to non-alignment. So kindly remember, there is one of the videos that we have recorded and a clear-cut elaborate analysis with respect to India, China and USA is explained in that video. The link for the same will also be given in our description box, so kindly look into it. That will have a clear-cut analysis. Should India be non-aligned or not when it comes to India and China's issue. But what are we looking under this article? We will be focusing on what has been said with respect to this article alone. A larger perspective has already been discussed, so kindly look into it. As the very name denotes, it is non-alignment with the political and economic setup prevalent back in the Cold War era. What is the political setup? You have one party which is supporting the democracy, and that happens to be United States of America, and there is another party, the Soviet Union, which is supporting the so-called socialistic rule. Then when it comes to the economics, you have one party which is supporting the free market. Then you have another party, that is the Soviet Union, which is supporting the state control as well. So there is ideological differences between United States of America and the erstwhile Soviet Union. So all those countries which were going towards United States of America became part of this particular alliance, and all those countries which were in close affiliation with Soviet Union became part of this alliance. But there were some countries which did not want to join either of these power blocks. Such country which did not join either of these two power blocks is what is called as the non-aligned countries. So who are these non-aligned countries? All those countries which did not join these political compartments is what is called as non-aligned country. Basically, when you look at non-aligned, it does not mean that they're not only joining this particular power block, it also means they would be able to take advantage from United States of America. They would also be able to take advantage from Soviet Union as well. So the non-alignment is not only about independence, it is also about acting independently with free autonomy, not being guided by another power as what should be done, what should not be done. So they are completely independent, and they are not coming under the fold of United States of America or the erstwhile Soviet Union. So the initial objectives of this non-alignment basically included the decolonization, universal nuclear disarmament, and against apartheid as well. Was these objectives successful? Yes, to an extent. When we go back to the year 1990s and post that, what we have is the balkanization or the disintegration of the Soviet Union. As a result of this, we have only unipolar world represented by the United States of America, and the Cold War came to an abrupt end. While this Cold War came to an abrupt end, the decolonization was almost successful. The apartheid movement in South Africa was almost dismantled as well, and the third objective of nuclear disarmament continues to be haunting the global community, and it is only this objective that was not met, or the objective was not successful according to this non-aligned movement which was initially started. So after the Cold War ended, many of the non-aligned movement countries were able to diversify their network, breaking the shackles of the east and the west, north and the south divide, and ultimately the whole idea of non-aligned movement was completely diluted as well. So what we have to realize is that when it comes to the non-aligned movement, we have just discussed about the basic meaning, but when it comes to the India, United States of America and China, and should India be part of an alignment with United States of America, has been explained in our earlier videos, so kindly look into that discussion. The second part of the article speaks about alliance. Alliance in international relations basically is nothing but a formal agreement between two or more countries where all these countries enter into an agreement, they enter into a consensus for mutual support in case of a war. Now let's take the example of Europe. So what happens? You have the United States of America, which is representing what is called as the NATO forces. What is this NATO forces? North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Then you have the Soviet Union back then, which had Eastern European countries entering into another pact called as the Warsaw Pact. So what is this Warsaw Pact? It is a treaty among the Soviet Union and other Eastern European states. So because these countries had a kind of an hysteria, they almost believed that there could be a possibility of war between the Eastern and the Western European countries. They entered into what is called as the alliance. So an alliance is nothing but an agreement, a consensus where two or more countries enter to prevent a common enemy or a common adversary. today the strategic interests of all the NATO countries, or for that factor the diluted Warsaw Pact and its countries, are totally different. Let's take for example the NATO, which is currently headquartered in Belgium, which is in Brussels, has different narratives as well. Why? Let's take the example of West Asia. We have the Iran policy here. When it comes to the Iran policy, United States of America withdrew from what is called as the Iran nuclear deal, but there are other countries like UK which are indirectly supporting this cause. Or let's say for example, when it comes to the US invasion of Iraq, there were some countries which was also opposing United States of America as well. Or let's say for example, when it comes to Russia, some Western European countries which also do not want sanctions imposed on Russia as well. Such is the deflection, such is the divergence, and there are different viewpoints and perspective, and they are no longer congruent when it comes to the alliance, either when it comes to Russia or with respect to the NATO forces as well. Now we have to look at the geostrategy. So what is this geostrategy? It includes geography on one side, it also has politics on one side. When you are speaking about politics, it is a dynamic process. You have political parties which enter the fray of elections 4 to 5 years, and they will have new political parties which can change the policies taken up by the earlier political party. So the politics is completely dynamic. But when you speak about geography, it is static in nature. It cannot be changed as well. So India's neighbors will always be Pakistan on the northwest, and it will also have China on the northeast as well. So the problem is the politics can change, but not the geography. So what is this geostrategy? Basically, this is about merging of politics and geography, where we would be able to strategize, plan to achieve our own national interest, which is of significance to that particular country. Now when it comes to India, what we have is the economic and security interest, both on the maritime level and also on the continental level as well. So kindly remember, the politics and the geography is taken into this particular picture. So when we are speaking about the maritime picture, what we have is the Indo-Pacific region. So in order to make sure that our security imperatives are met in the Indo-Pacific region, India has come up with number of initiatives. This can be in the form of Act East policy, both on the bilateral level and also on the multilateral level as well. And at the same time, India has also entered into an understanding with United States of America. United States of America also has its stake in Indo-Pacific Ocean, and India also has its stake in the Indo-Pacific region. So what we have is convergence when it comes to India and United States of America when it comes to the maritime domain, but the same cannot be spoken when it comes to the land or the continental domain. Why? Let's take the example of Afghanistan. The United States of America is planning to withdraw from Afghanistan, which happens to be a landmass. In case we should not have any security threat from Afghanistan, we would require a close coordination with Iran, and we would also require a close coordination with Russia. So our maritime interest with United States of America might be in sync, might be in resonance, but this is not the same when it comes to the continental. Why? Because United States of America has differences with Iran, it has differences with Russia, but India will have to be close to both these partners as well. And at the same time, when it comes to the export sector and also when it comes to the import sector, we have what is called as the Central Asian countries. So to the Central Asian countries, India has major exports. With respect to Central Asian countries, India also imports energy and gas reserves as well. So we may require a mutual understanding with Iran. Why? Because we have to travel through the Chabahar port, enter Iran, and ultimately reach Central Asia. Why? Because Pakistan we may not be able to enter, and we may not be able to transfer everything via the air as well. This will require shipment transport, and we may also require land transport as well. So our convergence with United States of America is only on the maritime domain, and that is not on the continental domain, is what this article trying to speak about. So what we see with all this is that there is convergence of issues with respect to United States of America, and there is divergence as well. In order to reduce this divergence, United States of America has to view ties with India as a joint venture and not as a dominating or a hegemonic partner, or in the form of an alliance where both can pursue shared objectives that are mutually beneficial and also address differences in their own perspectives. So what we have to understand is that United States of America should view India as an equal partner. We also have to wait and watch which political party will be elected in United States of America, what would be its policies, and how there would be convergence of ideas when it comes to India and United States of America in the near future. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article here is speaking about Chardham project. The Chardham project basically includes connecting four important shrines. It includes Yamunotri, Gangotri, Badrinath and Kedarnath. So this is a project for better connectivity to pilgrimage centers in Uttarakhand. What was the need of this particular project? Back in the year 2013, what we witnessed was the Uttarakhand floods. This had devastated the entire area and the road connectivity was also not that good as well. In order to make sure that this devastation and the road infrastructure is reworked, that is why this Chardham project was initiated by the government of India. And at the same time, the roads leading to Gangotri as well as Badrinath are also important when it comes to the strategic point of view. Why? Because these roads are also used for supply and deployment to the defense establishments as well. They would be able to take this particular road and reach the Indo-China border. What is the concern right now? There was one of the petition that was filed with the National Green Tribunal. What was this petition all about? It said that all these road construction is happening through some of the ecological sensitive zone. Since it is passing through the ecological sensitive zone, some of the environmental clearances were not meeting the standards. This can result in catastrophe and this can also result in environmental threat as well. Such was the petition which was filed in the National Green Tribunal, but the National Green Tribunal did not assent to it and ultimately it gave the order in favor of the government. But then this petitioner now goes to the Supreme Court of India and the Supreme Court of India looks into this particular issue and also questions the government whether there is environmental threat or not. Has environmental clearances been given or not? And it has also given the recommendations to the government that in case you are constructing this particular road, you have to comply by the Union Road Ministry Circular of the year 2018, where it has also asked the government to make sure that there is more afforestation in this particular region, undertake more of plant growing in this particular region, and also increase the green cover where there has been destruction. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says digital divide shadows post-pandemic education. In the past 1 to 2 months, we have discussed about digital divide. This is about access to the internet and those people who do not have access to the internet. For those people who have access to the internet, they are able to stick on to the education. They are able to get all the knowledge from the internet platforms. But this is not happening with the rural people. This is not happening with the poor section, and then there are maximum number of students who are not able to get the fruits of digital revolution. In this particular backdrop, the article gives certain statistics. Let's try and understand what are these statistics. Across India, only 1 in 10 households have a computer, whether it is a desktop, laptop or a tablet. Almost a quarter of all homes have internet facilities accessed via the fixed or the mobile network using any device including the smartphones. It further says most of these internet-enabled homes are located in cities. As we have discussed, there is urban and rural divide where 42% have internet access. In rural areas, however, there is only 15% who are connected to the internet, which we have already discussed that there is urban as well as the rural divide. The national capital has the highest internet access with 55% of the home having such facilities. Himachal Pradesh and Kerala are the only other states where more than half of the households have internet. What we have to understand with this particular statistics is that digital divide is perpetuating more and is exacerbating the issues of digital revolution. It is not only about internet connectivity. It is not only about having desktops or laptops. It is also about accessing it as well. Let's imagine I am illiterate person, or let's imagine that I have no idea about the computer or the internet. It still means that I am not able to access the digital revolution. This means it is also leading me to digital poverty as well. This also means all the fruits of digital revolution are not being taken by these set of people as well. So it is important that we endeavor to ensure that no one is left behind and no citizen suffer because of this digital poverty. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into some of the preliminary practice questions. Which of the following statements is or correct? Jaipur has received UNESCO World Heritage Tag. Patrika Gate is located in Jodhpur. The answer to this is one only. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Kindly remember, Patrika Gate is not in Jodhpur, instead it is in Jaipur, and Jaipur happens to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now let's look into the next practice question. With reference to Taj Trapezium Zone, which of the following statement is or correct? It is defined area around the Taj Mahal to protect the monument from pollution. Supreme Court has banned the use of coal or coke in industries located in TTZ. Taj Mahal is the only monument included in this zone. The answer to this is 1 and 2 only. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference of Taj Mahal in this article. Kindly remember, it does not only include Taj Mahal, it also includes Agra as well as Fatehpur Sikri as well. Now let's look into the next practice question. Consider the following statements with respect to the parliamentary committee. Most committees are standing as their existence is uninterrupted and usually reconstituted on an annual basis. The recommendations made by the standing committee are not binding on the executive. Committee meetings are closed door and members are not bound by the party whip. Which of the above statements are correct? The answer to this is 1, 2 and 3. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. Universal Immunization Program provides free of cost vaccines to which of the following diseases? Diphtheria, tetanus, polio, measles and hepatitis B. The answer to this is 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Why have we taken this practice question? Because of the reference given under this article. But this article also mentions about some of the statistics which says although almost all children in India are vaccinated against tuberculosis and receive their birth dose of polio vaccine, 2 out of 5 children do not complete their immunization. The article further says that most of these children remain unprotected against the measles. Full immunization also means child receives a cocktail of 8 vaccine doses in the first year of life. The second article, which is about vaccine for all, is speaking about how we require a policy when it comes to the administration of vaccine. We are speaking about the COVID-19, and in the near future, whenever there is a vaccine, we require a policy for its implementation. Whom it has to be administered, what doses has to be administered, when it has to be administered. For all this, what we require is a policy. So the government of India will have to make sure that there is a COVID-19 specific vaccine program, and that will have to be implemented, for which what we require is the planning, says this article. Now let's look into the next practice question. What is or the importance of the United Nations Convention to combat desertification? It aims to promote effective action through innovative national programs and supportive international partnerships. It has a special particular focus on South Asia and North Africa regions, and its secretariat facilitates the allocation of major portion of financial resources to these regions. This is a wrong statement. It is committed to bottom-up approach, encouraging the participation of local people for combating desertification. Select the correct answer. The answer to this is 1 and 3. Why? Because the second statement is wrong. There is no such funding when it comes to South Asia and North Africa. Now let's look into the mains practice question. Strong local governance and community participation will act as the starting point to clean up a dysfunctional system and transform electoral politics. Discuss. Unsustainable growth is environmentally damaging and the greatest threat to our future prosperity. What steps can be taken to balance developmental needs along with environmental protection? So please write all your answers on the comment section. Peer review, come up with constructive criticism. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.